All right, so are you ready to really get into it today? We're diving into El Socialismo y lo woke.pdf.
Oh, yeah, this one's a doozy.
It really is. I mean, talk about a controversial take. We're going to break it down, though.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for our listeners, just a quick reminder, this deep dive is all about exploring some pretty provocative ideas.
Yeah.
And we're not endorsing anything, just, laying it all out there.
Try to understand it, yeah.
Exactly. So what really stood out to you? What's the big takeaway from this document?
Well, I mean, the author's main argument is pretty bold. They're saying that socialism, especially in its modern woke form, is basically functioning like a religion.
Whoa, okay, hold up.
Yeah.
Socialism as a religion, that's a big claim. How are they even connecting those two things?
Right. It's like what? But they get into it. They actually break it down using concepts like original sin, guilt, even redemption.
Okay, I gotta admit, you've got my attention now.
Wow.
So how does the author even start building this argument? Where's the foundation?
Well, they start with the human brain.
Okay.
Yeah. So they argue that millions of years of evolution have hardwired certain structures into our brains. And those structures, they say, make us prone to ritualization and even,
Fetishism.
Yeah, fetishism. I know, this sounds kind of out there, but bear with me.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So, how do they go from our brains, this basic biology stuff, to, these huge social movements? Socialism, the woke movement, it seems like a stretch.
It did to me at first, too. But the way they explain it is kind of interesting. Think of it this way. Our brains, they've evolved to prioritize stability.
Right. I mean, that makes sense. Survival and all that.
Right, exactly. So the author uses this analogy of shock absorbers and air-filled tires on a car.
Okay.
They're smoothing out the bumps on the road,
Yeah.
right? So even though the world around us is constantly changing, our brains, they have this built-in resistance to sudden shifts.
So you're saying our brains are kind of lagging behind, even when society's speeding ahead.
Yeah, kind of. It's like our brains are built for the long haul,
Yeah.
For survival in a world that, for most of human history, changed very slowly.
That makes sense. It's
Yeah.
like we're running on old software, even though the world's constantly updating.
Exactly. And the author's point is that even with neuroplasticity, that ability of our brains to rewire themselves,
Yeah.
it doesn't change those deep-seated structures, the ones that have been shaped over millennia.
Okay, I think I'm following you. But where does atheism fit into all of this? The author brought up the USSR, right?
Yeah. That's a perfect example of how these ingrained structures, they can actually endure even when a society tries to, suppress them.
Interesting.
The USSR enforced atheism for decades.
Right.
But when that control loosened, most people went right back to religious beliefs, or at least agnostic ones.
So it's like those structures were just waiting for the chance to, resurface.
Exactly. And that's where the author links these brain structures to the rise of socialism and the woke movement.
Ah, okay, now it's all starting to click. So they're saying that these movements tap into those ancient parts of our brains.
The ones that crave ritual and meaning-making.
Fascinating. But we've got to take a break here. Don't go anywhere, listeners, because in the next part, we're going to explore how the author argues that socialism, especially its modern woke form, has actually adopted a framework that's eerily similar to traditional religions. We're talking about concepts like original sin, and trust me, you won't want to miss this. Okay, so we left off on this pretty wild idea, socialism as a religion. And the author really doubles down with this idea of original sin, but in the context of socialism and the woke movement. So what's the deal with that?
Yeah, they get into how the woke movement basically identifies certain traits as inherent sources of guilt, being male, white, heterosexual.
Okay, so those are the sins, basically. I mean, that's a pretty heavy accusation.
It is, right.
Yeah.
And according to the author, these traits are presented as, the new original sin.
Wow. So if those are the sins, then what's the path to redemption in this framework?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. The author says it's about embracing socialist ideology.
Okay.
By adopting the right beliefs and doing the right actions, you can supposedly, cleanse yourself of this inherent guilt.
Whoa, so it's almost like a baptism or something, washing away those original sins by becoming a socialist.
Yeah, that's the idea they're putting forward.
That's pretty intense. So let me get this straight. By becoming a socialist, someone can basically be absolved of being male, white, or heterosexual.
That's how the author presents it, yeah.
I mean, talk about high stakes.
Right. And the author goes on to suggest that achieving purity in this system, it requires constant self-examination
Oh.
and this dedication to following these, like, ever-evolving dogmas.
It sounds exhausting, honestly, like a never-ending game of trying to keep up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the author even uses this analogy of a soccer game,
Okay.
where one team starts off with an automatic goal against them.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. That represents the inherent disadvantage placed on people who are seen as guilty by these woke standards, right?
Exactly. Like, no matter how hard they try, no matter how many goals they score, by conforming to the ideology, they're always battling that initial deficit.
It's like a system designed to keep you feeling guilty, like you're never quite good enough.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And this ties directly into the concept of purity tests, right?
Oh, yeah. Those are everywhere these days.
It's like people are constantly being judged.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always this potential for being, ostracized if you don't pass these, like, arbitrary tests.
It's a pretty unforgiving environment.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, what happens to those who don't buy into this system at all?
Right. Like, what about the people who question these dogmas or maybe just live their lives without constantly checking their woke scorecard?
Well, the author has some pretty strong opinions on that.
Oh.
And it leads us to the next part of their argument.
I'm almost afraid to ask, but what happens to those people?
Well, the author argues that the woke movement actually has its own version of apostasy.
Apostasy, like abandoning a religion.
Exactly. And they say the consequences for this apostasy can be pretty severe.
So questioning or dissenting from woke ideology is basically like abandoning a religion in their eyes.
That's what they're suggesting, yeah.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. And they give this really striking example to illustrate it.
Oh.
They talk about this gay man who refused to even consider dating another gay man just because the other man was conservative.
Wow. So even within like a marginalized group, there's this pressure to conform to a specific ideology.
Yeah, the author is arguing that ideological purity can become so rigid that it actually overrides personal connections.
It's like your identity isn't enough, you also have to think the right way.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that concept of a trinity within the woke movement, remember?
Oh yeah, the socialism, feminism, woke ideology trifecta.
Right. They're arguing that you can't embrace one without accepting the others.
It's like a package deal.
It is. Like this all-encompassing worldview that dictates not just your politics, but your social values, your relationships, everything.
That's a lot to unpack. So where does traditional religion fit in all this? Like Christianity, for example. Does it have a place in this woke worldview?
That's a key question, and the author's answer is pretty provocative.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
They argue that the woke movement isn't just indifferent to traditional religions, they actually seek to replace them.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and they specifically call out Christianity as the main target.
Okay, so why Christianity specifically? What makes it such a threat to woke ideology?
The author points to Christianity's stances on things like abortion and traditional gender roles.
Okay.
They argue that those views clash with the woke movement's principles of progress and equality.
It's interesting because on the surface, it seems like both Christianity and the woke movement care about social justice.
Right, you'd think they'd be on the same page.
But the author's saying that their visions of justice are completely different.
Exactly. It's not just about different methods. It's like two totally different worldviews clashing.
And that brings us to some pretty big questions about the consequences of this ideological shift. What does the author say about the potential damage this could cause?
They're very concerned about the potential negative consequences of the woke movement gaining too much power.
Like what?
They use a very powerful analogy to illustrate this point.
Okay, let's hear it.
They compare the spread of woke ideology to the colonization of the Americas.
Whoa, that's a heavy comparison. How does that even work?
Well, think about it. European colonizers imposed their values on indigenous populations,
Yeah.
often with devastating consequences. The author is worried that the woke movement might do something similar.
Like forcing their values on people who don't share them.
Exactly. They argue that this could silence dissenting voices and create a culture of fear and conformity.
It's a chilling thought, honestly. And it ties into what the author said about hate speech,
Yes,
right?
right. They point out the double standard,
Mm-hmm.
where criticism of certain groups is totally unacceptable.
Right.
But criticism of others is not only allowed, it's actually encouraged.
So it's like some groups are more protected than others.
That's what the author observes.
It
Yeah,
seems like that would just create more division and resentment.
it definitely could.
Huh.
And it makes you question the woke movement's true motives.
Right. Like, is it really about equality and justice, or is it about power and control?
That's a question the author really grapples with.
So, do they have an answer? Is the woke movement a genuine force for good or something more cynical?
Well, they suggest that it might be a way for socialist parties to stay relevant in a changing political landscape.
Interesting. So they're latching on to this movement to stay in the game, even if their original ideology isn't popular anymore.
That's one interpretation. And the author points to this woke arms race among politicians.
Yeah, we talked about that before.
Where they're all competing to be seen as the most woke, even if it means supporting policies that might actually do more harm than good.
So it's more about signaling virtue than actually solving problems.
That's the concern, yeah. But, the author doesn't just leave us with a bunch of doom and gloom.
Oh, good. Because I was starting to feel a little hopeless.
They actually offer some solutions, some ways to mitigate these negative consequences.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's the antidote to all of this?
Well, that's what we'll explore the next part. The author outlines a path forward.
Okay.
One that emphasizes dialogue, critical thinking, and a more nuanced understanding of social justice.
Sounds promising. I can't wait to hear more about that. Listeners, stick with us because in the next segment, we'll dive into the author's proposed solutions for navigating this complex and often contentious landscape. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, and it's been pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
But the author does hint at some potential solutions, right?
Right, like they don't just leave us hanging with all these criticisms.
Good, because I was starting to lose hope. So what's the antidote? What do they suggest we do?
Well, they actually offer a pretty clear path forward. They emphasize things like open dialogue, critical thinking, and a more nuanced understanding of social justice.
Okay, I like where this is going. So what's step one? Where do we even begin to address all these complex issues?
Well, the author says we need to start by recognizing the potential harms caused by the woke movement.
So, like, admitting that even with good intentions, things can go wrong.
Exactly. And that we need to be willing to change course, even if it means challenging our own beliefs.
That's tough, but I get it.
Yeah, it's not easy. But the author brings up that woke arms race, again, remember, with politicians competing to be the most progressive.
Yeah, we talked about that, how it can actually lead to bad policies.
Right, and the author says that this kind of competition can be really detrimental. It leads to policies that are more about looking good than actually helping people.
So what's the alternative? How do we get away from this woke arms race and actually start making real progress?
The author suggests that we need to, shift our focus. Instead of chasing after the woke label, we should be prioritizing policies that actually have a proven track record of success.
So it's about being more practical, less about ideology.
Yeah, it's about focusing on what works in the real world.
I can get behind that. But how do we get there? How do we change the conversation, move away from the virtue signaling and toward actual solutions?
Well, the author says we need to foster a culture of open and honest dialogue.
So, like creating spaces where people can actually disagree without being attacked or silenced.
Exactly. They argue that this kind of dialogue is crucial for finding common ground.
Making real progress.
Yeah, exactly. It allows us to challenge our own assumptions, consider different perspectives, and ultimately come up with solutions that work for everyone.
I love that. So it's about recognizing that we're all in this together, even if we don't always agree on the best way forward.
Exactly. And that brings us to the author's final suggestion, cultivating critical thinking skills.
So we can't just take everything we hear at face value.
Right. We need to be able to evaluate information carefully, question assumptions, and consider multiple perspectives.
So it's about doing our own research, forming our own opinions.
Exactly. Especially in today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the hype or the outrage.
For sure. But the author is reminding us that we need to think for ourselves.
We need to be informed citizens, not just passive consumers of whatever narrative is being pushed on us.
Absolutely. And that's what this deep dive has been all about, right?
Yeah, challenging our assumptions, encouraging critical thinking.
Exactly. We've explored some really challenging ideas. But hopefully it's given you, the listener, some new perspectives to consider.
And hopefully some hope, too, because it's not all doom and gloom.
Definitely not. The author offers some concrete solutions, some ways to move forward in a more constructive way.
And that's what we all want, right?
Right.
So to our listeners, we encourage you to read the full document, El Socialismo y la Woke.pdf, for yourself.
It's a lot to digest, but it's worth the effort.
And most importantly, keep those critical thinking skills sharp. Question everything, consider all sides, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.